Okay, everybody, this is Joseph P. Farrell with news and views from the Nefarium on Thursday, May 7th, 2015. And there's a bit of news and an announcement. So let me get the announcement out of the way. We've been having some website issues today, and Daniel and I were uh, on the phone with each other and our host and everything. So we're trying to get those resolved. It appears that there's been some internet outages around the country, so some of you have had access to the website and some of you haven't. And then as we were getting into that, we discovered that there were some issues with the hosting. So we're trying to get those resolved. Please be patient, bear with us. It's going to take a while because apparently there's a lot of stuff that for some reason went kind of wacko on the host with the hosting. Anyway, so let's get to what the Nefarium has been up to this week, and this is very, very interesting. This story came out on May 4th, and a lot of you sent this article to me, and I find it profoundly interesting, particularly given the subject matter of the book that I'm currently writing, which is about the European Union in some respects. And let me read the title, the headline of this article, and then read some of its contents to you, and then give you my usual high octane take on what may be going on a bit behind the scenes. The headline is Outrage as European Union chief, that would be Jean-Claude Juncker, calls for a Euro army commanded by Brussels to take on Russia and ISIS. Subtitle of this is Brussels top bureaucrat came under fire yesterday after calling for a European army to be set up as part of a common foreign and security policy. Now, needless to say, this isn't playing too well in Great Britain for all the reasons I'm sure all of you can imagine. So this story does come out of Great Britain, and now let me read the contents, some of the contents. Jean-Claude Juncker, backed by leading German politicians, said a Euro army commanded by Brussels would provide a, quote, more credible, unquote, response to threats, including from Russia. A European army would be a tragedy for the Ukraine, says the United Kingdom defense spokesman Mike Hookham. We have all seen the utter mess that the EU has made of the Eurozone economy, so how can we even think of trusting them with this island's defense? This is simply a disaster in the making that would see Gibraltar return to Spain and the Falkland Islands left open to an unopposed invasion by Argentina. Even more concerning would be the prospect of British troops under European command, read German command here, folks, operating in the eastern Ukraine. The Conservative Member of Parliament, Dr. Julian Lewis, of the Commons Defense Committee, stated, quote, opponents of the European Army concept have always said that this would undermine the whole basis of NATO. But not so in Germany. Listen to what the Germans are saying. European President Mr. Juncker, who's long advocated a European force, told Germany's Welt am Sonntag Sunday newspaper, such an army would help us to build a common foreign and security policy, as well as jointly assume the responsibilities of Europe in the world. Europe's image has suffered dramatically and also in terms of foreign policy. We don't seem to be taken entirely seriously. Such a force could, he said, react credibly to dangers facing the European Union's 28 member states or its neighbors. Now stop right there. The dangers aren't from Russia. Russia is not planning an invasion of Europe, and even though ISIS is a threat in the terrorist sense, it certainly poses no threat in the conventional military sense to Europe. So in other words, what we're looking at here, in my opinion, is spin, and there's another objective for the creation of this trans-European army. So we'll get to that in just a minute. Now, Moscow's suspicions, continuing with the article, of such a move will be compounded by Mr. Juncker's specific statement that forming such a body would make it clear to Russia that the EU is, quote, serious about upholding the value of the European Union, unquote. And again, folks, stop and consider. Russia has nowhere challenged the European Union. It has never questioned the value of the European Union. If anything, Russia, if you go back and look at the post-Soviet era, beginning with Yeltsin, even with Gorbachev, you'll recall, at the very end of the Soviet era, was making speeches about Russia and Russians being part of Europe, being part of the European culture. So again, I question Mr. Juncker's evaluation here. Russia's not challenging the value of the European Union. All right. Now, continuing down a little bit further in the article here, it states policymakers in Germany also backed the Euro Army move. Norbert Röttgen, chairman of the German Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee, said, quote, the time had come for such a development. The Europeans spend enormous sums of money for the military combined, much more than Russia, said Mr. Röttgen. But our military capabilities remain an insufficient security policy as long as we maintain small national armies, which make and buy many parts of the same thing on a smaller scale. The German Green Member of Parliament, Jan Philipp Albrecht, said, quote, I support, listen, this is the German Green Party here, quote, I support Juncker in building an EU army if it means the termination of all European member states' armies and is controlled by the European Parliament. Now, catch that, folks. He didn't say the European Commission. If you study the structure of the EU, you'll discover that the European Parliament has almost no legislative powers or functions. The EU is a top-down, oligarchical structure. In a certain sense, you could compare it to a commissariat system and a dictatorship. So that's a key clue there. Last month, German Defense Minister Ursula von der Leyen said an EU army should be a long-term goal. Now, I've already indicated to you my suspicions about the reasons that this is being advocated now. And make no mistake about this, folks. A trans-European army would be absolutely more or less under the predominant influence both of Germany and to a lesser extent of France, but for the most part of Germany. This is in a sense, a very clever way of rearming and extending the influence of those two powers throughout the European Union. All right. So in other words, you can forget about Brussels dictating the defense and security and foreign policy. Ultimately, that's going to be coming out of Paris and Berlin. All right. So what's the real behind the scenes thing that's going on here? And I suspect it's this. If you've been following my thinking and my blogs on the website and in these news and views, I've been advancing the proposition that the United States is slowly pivoting its military presence in Europe out of Western Europe and into that old Versailles cordon sanitaire, consisting of the Baltic states down through Poland, down into Romania. That zone that was established by the politicians at Versailles to separate Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, and German dominance in Central Europe. All right. The United States, in other words, is positioning its forces in the middle of those two powers. And I suspect that the reason why it is doing that is that it is extremely suspicious both of Russian and of German motivations and trying to prevent and establish bases that will allow it to interdict Russian energy supplies to Europe. So in other words, this is a move by the United States to keep its thumb on the European Union and to prevent any bolt of Europe into a greater Eurasian free trade zone. All right. Now, let's look at another factor that's playing here, and that's Shinzo Abe over in Japan. You recall that Japan has, under his government, raised repeatedly, and he's pushing for this very hard now in the Japanese Diet. He has raised Japan's defense expenditures, and he wants to do so again. In other words, he is rearming Japan. Now, the short-term to mid-term reason here that we all know is that Abe is doing this to a certain extent out of fealty for Japan's obligations to its defense commitments to the United States. In other words, Japan is taking on a greater burden of the security of the Pacific because the United States, as we all know, is badly, badly overextended. All right. But there's a longer term goal here, I think, with Abe and the Japanese rearmament, and that is that if he rearms, this puts him in a much stronger position. And ultimately, we know that Japan has been wanting American military bases out of Japan, particularly in Okinawa, for quite some time. This is a sore, sore issue in the Okinawa prefecture in Japan. So eventually, a Japanese rearmament program would give Japan more leverage so that in the eventuality that they see that Washington, D.C. is no longer able nor speaks for the good of the alliance as a whole, Japan can step in and take over its own defense. I suspect, therefore, that this is ultimately the reason for these calls in Europe. Because as we've seen, Europe was not happy. Ultimately, and underneath it all, in spite of all the pledges, public pledges of support for Washington and the sanctions against Russia, Europe, and particularly France and Germany, and they're in the driver's seat, they were not happy with Washington's decision, and they are not happy with American unipolarism, and they are not happy with the way the United States has handled the Middle East. So I suspect that there is a long-term goal here. And the long-term goal is ultimately, and mark my words, this may seem totally unwarranted, but the long-term goal, particularly for the German politicians since the end of World War II, has been to play along with the Atlantic Alliance until such time as Europe can assume its own defense and then kick the American bases altogether out of Europe. So in other words, the real long-term goal with the creation of this European army is for them to be able to arbitrate their affairs on their own and no longer be in a subservient position to Washington, D.C. It's not about Russia, because Russia is not threatening Europe. That's the bottom line. And it is not about ISIS. It is about Washington, D.C. So this is a long-term game, and please note what happened. The United Kingdom is not happy with this, and this could be the thing that breaks the camel's back and pulls the United Kingdom back out of the Eurozone completely and in a much tighter relationship once again with Washington, D.C. So time alone will tell. That's it. Bear with us, folks, on the website issues. We're working on them. We're going to try and get those resolved as soon as we can. I do have a number of talk show interviews coming up. I'll try and keep everybody posted about that. That's it, everybody. See you on the flip side, and God bless.